Racist judge gives an unfair sentence. Freezes when the president calls. Drexel Fontaine had never once intended to become the face of a civil rights debate. He was 26 years old, tall and lean, with a quiet grace that came from long years of practicing self-restraint. He had been raised in an impoverished neighborhood in Greenwood Falls, an aging town whose factories were closing one by one, leaving the main street populated by more boarded windows than open shops. It was a place clinging to a past that had been fading even before Drexel's parents were born. Amid the worn bricks and the skeletal remains of rusted playground swings, Drexel had found hope in his mother's unwavering confidence that he was meant for better things. But Greenwood Falls was not the kind of place that extended many second chances to young black men. Sometimes, it didn't even offer first chances. Drexel recognized that truth the first time a police cruiser slowed to keep pace with him while he was walking home from high school. He had done nothing wrong, but found himself scrutinized, asked to empty his pockets, and nearly arrested simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the age of 18, he had lost count of how many times he'd been treated as a threat. Each new encounter chipped away at his boyish optimism, forging in him a quiet, simmering resilience that would one day meet its greatest challenge. His mother, Roberta Fontaine, was the anchor of his life. She worked 2 cleaning jobs, one at a local motel, another at the courthouse. She tried to shield her son from the brunt of injustice by teaching him patience and kindness. "There's no shame in stepping lightly around hatred," she would say, her voice tinged with wisdom and sorrow. "But never let it define who you are." Despite that advice, neither of them could have predicted the day when hatred would rear its head in the most official and irrevocable manner. It all started on a sweltering afternoon in mid-July when Drexel was driving a borrowed sedan down Oakmont Road. The car belonged to his mother's colleague, a generous older lady named Ms. Carver, who occasionally lent out her vehicles to folks at the motel. Drexel had taken the car to run errands for his mother, who was bedridden with the flu. On the passenger seat lay a paper bag of groceries, ginger ale, crackers, a small packet of medicine. And as he drove, Drexel's mind flitted between concern for his mother and the list of bills piling up on their kitchen counter. He stopped at a gas station, nearly out of fuel. He carefully placed the last few dollars he had into the tank. He wiped sweat from his brow, feeling the sun pounding the back of his neck. Overhead, cicadas whirred in a feverish chorus, and the heavy scent of asphalt and gasoline lingered in the air. But just as he returned the pump handle to its cradle, he heard the screech of car tires. Instinctively, he turned to see an unmarked police car coming to a halt near the pump he'd just vacated. 2 uniformed police officers stepped out. One was older, stout, with close-cropped gray hair. The other was younger, his eyes filled with what Drexel immediately recognized as an eager desire to prove himself. They took a quick look around and zeroed in on him. The older officer approached with one hand resting conspicuously near his holster. "Whose car is this?" the officer asked curtly. Drexel explained calmly that it was on loan from a friend. As expected, the officer's face hardened. The younger one circled around, checking the plates. Drexel wasn't surprised when they asked for license and registration. He handed over his license, but explained that the registration was in the glove compartment. With a grim nod, the older officer opened the passenger door, rummaging through the paperwork, passing them one by one to his partner. "Cars have expired tags," the older cop said, eyebrows lifting. "Do you know anything about that?" The truth was Drexel didn't. Ms. Carver had never mentioned it, and he certainly hadn't thought to check the stickers. He swallowed, suddenly feeling a wave of fear. Expired tags could be just a minor violation, or it could escalate in ways that only someone who had grown up in Greenwood Falls would understand. He tried to explain that he had just borrowed the vehicle and hadn't realized the tags were out of date. The officers exchanged glances. "We'll have to take you in for a bit of a talk," said the older one in a tone that made it clear it wasn't merely an invitation. "Cars could be stolen for all we know." "It's not stolen," Drexel insisted, his voice caught between calm explanation and dread. The frustration began to well up inside him. "You can call Ms. Carver." It's her car. The younger cop leaned over, hooking his thumbs in the loops of his belt. Let's do this the easy way. Hands behind your back. We'll sort this out at the station. And just like that, a mundane errand turned into a life-altering moment. Drexel found himself driven to the station, questioned for hours, and ultimately charged with possession of a stolen vehicle even after Ms. Carver confirmed that she had indeed loaned it to him. The explanation vanished into a procedural black hole as soon as the local district attorney's office got involved. The DA was up for re-election and had made a big stink lately about cracking down on auto theft after a rash of vehicle break-ins. Drexel found himself a convenient scapegoat, even if he had never so much as thought of stealing a car. The system latched onto him, and no amount of Ms. Carver's well-intentioned testimonies or Roberta Fontaine's desperate pleas could dislodge him from its jaws. Drexel's mother pooled what little money she had saved to hire a local public defender to represent him. The defender, a weary man named Harold Menendez, juggled more cases than was probably ethical. But seeing Drexel's earnest demeanor, Harold took a personal interest. "We'll fight it," he would say. "We just have to get the right judge and show we've got evidence Miss Carver was the owner and that you had permission." What they didn't realize was that their case was assigned to Judge Mason H. Barringer. Known throughout the region for his stern attitude and an unspoken but widely recognized bias, Judge Barringer was rumored to come down harder on defendants of color. And in Greenwood Falls, a rumor like that seldom existed without a kernel of truth. Drexel had heard dark stories from others who stood before Barringer. Excessively long sentences for minor drug possession, scathing lectures that often contained coded language about your kind, and unusual bail conditions that seemed designed to keep people behind bars. But nothing could have prepared him for the suffocating feeling of standing in that dark wood-paneled courtroom, waiting to be judged by a man whose cold, pale eyes seemed to lock onto Drexel with immediate disdain. The courthouse itself was a relic from another era. Thick pillars lined the entrance, and the interior smelled of old leather, dust, and the faint linger of coffee. The acoustics were poor, causing voices to echo awkwardly. Above the bench hung an imposing portrait of a former judge who had presided during the 1950s, a time in Greenwood Falls' history not particularly known for tolerance or civil rights. On the day of the trial, Drexel arrived wearing a simple brown suit borrowed from his uncle. He couldn't afford anything else, and he wanted to show respect to the court. His mother sat in the gallery, hands folded tightly on her lap. Ms. Carver was there too, wringing her fingers anxiously. A few neighbors from Drexel's block had come out in solidarity. They knew him as a quiet, polite young man who sometimes helped them carry groceries or fix a broken fence. And then there was Judge Barringer, robed in black, shoulders stiff, his gavel resting ominously before him. Before the trial began, he made it clear he wouldn't tolerate grandstanding in his courtroom. His voice was deep, and he stared down anyone who dared meet his gaze for longer than a second. Prosecutor Whitfield, a middle-aged woman with a severe bun and a crisp white blouse, presented her case with robotic efficiency. According to the official line, the state had reason to believe Drexel had borrowed the car under suspicious circumstances, and that the expired tags were an indicator the vehicle might be stolen. No matter how many times Ms. Carver stood up, voice trembling, to clarify that it was her fault the tags were expired and that she had personally handed the keys to Drexel, the prosecution always found an angle to question her credibility. Perhaps Ms. Carver was getting senile. Perhaps she had been coerced or threatened. The insinuations were as brazen as they were unfounded. Harold Menendez argued that the entire case was a grave misunderstanding. He pointed out that no actual evidence indicated Drexel had stolen anything, only an expired registration. More importantly, Ms. Carver's testimony, along with the paperwork proving her ownership, should have ended the matter entirely. But to everyone's astonishment, Judge Barringer insisted that more investigation was needed. He denied the defense's motion to dismiss and allowed the prosecution to continue pressing forward. Drexel watched this unfold with mounting dread. He could see the dismay on his mother's face. She tightened her grip on her purse, as if willing herself not to leap from her seat in protest. Each rejection from the judge struck like a hammer blow, shaping the horrifying realization that this trial was nothing more than a formality. The outcome felt predetermined. Days stretched into weeks. The local media caught wind of the case, though it never made front-page news. Still, the coverage was enough that some corners of the community began to mumble about the potential bias at play. A journalist from a regional newspaper tried to interview Judge Berenger about his track record, only to receive a curt no comment. Rumors spread about potential alliances between the judge and certain local politicians who thrived on tough on-crime rhetoric. The looming re-election for the district attorney's office further complicated everything. By the time the final day of trial arrived, tension hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Drexel sat at the defense table, hands pressed together, lips moving in a silent prayer. He prayed for mercy, for fairness, for his mother's heartbreak to end. He had never prayed so fervently in his life, not even when they threatened to cut off their electricity during a bitter January some years ago. Judge Berenger took his seat. His gaze swept over the courtroom. He cleared his throat, and the audience fell silent. Everyone could sense that it was about to come to a head. The judge's voice was measured, but something in it reverberated with a cold finality. Having considered the evidence, I find that the defendant, Mr. Fontaine, was in possession of a vehicle that was not properly registered and for which the ownership had been called into question. While Ms. Carver did testify that she loaned him the vehicle, there remains ambiguity regarding the defendant's knowledge of its legal status. A flurry of confusion rippled through the courtroom. There was no ambiguity. Ms. Carver had spelled everything out. Drexel's heart thundered in his chest. He could see Harold Menendez shaking his head in disbelief. Judge Berenger continued, "Therefore, I am sentencing Mr. Fontaine to 2 years in a state correctional facility, citing the seriousness of the offense and the defendant's apparent disregard for the law." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Ms. Carver collapsed into tears. Drexel's mother let out a pained cry that echoed off the walls. 2 years in prison for an expired tag and a mistaken car theft charge? It was surreal, insane, a shocking display of judicial power run amok. Drexel's vision tunneled. His mind whirled in confusion and panic. Menendez stood up, voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Your Honor, we respectfully request a stay of sentence, pending an appeal." This is Judge Berenger's gavel cracked down like thunder. Motion denied. Court is adjourned. The abrupt end sent shockwaves through the room. Drexel felt the bailiff's hand on his arm, urging him to stand. He turned to see his mother, tears streaming down her cheeks, her lips quivering as she tried to speak. He wanted to run to her, to cradle her in his arms, and say it would all be okay. But metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, and he was led away under the watchful gaze of the man who had just ripped away 2 years of his life on a whim. The final blow came when he was taken into a small holding cell behind the courtroom, Ms. Carver's pleas echoing in his ears. He sank down onto a cold metal bench, eyes closed, wondering how on earth this was the same country that promised justice for all. He'd read about blatant injustice in history books, but to experience it firsthand was to feel as though an anchor had been tied to his soul and flung into the darkest depths of the ocean. News of the sentencing spread quickly. Though Greenwood Falls was small, outrage buzzed through the community. The local newspaper published an editorial calling the sentence draconian and hinting that racial bias might have played a role. More than that, across social media, a few activists latched onto the story, demanding attention for Drexel's plight. 2 years for a borrowed car, where's the justice? Read one headline on a popular blog. Hashtags began circulating, calling for an official inquiry into the judge's sentencing habits. A local civil rights group, the Greenwood Falls Community Coalition, rallied for a protest outside the courthouse. But as is often the case, the protest initially was small. Only a couple dozen people gathered with signs, chanting for justice. The mainstream press largely ignored it. And inside the jail where Drexel was being temporarily held, he felt only isolation and despair. He didn't see the protest. He could only imagine it, clinging to the faint hope that perhaps some measure of truth would eventually come to light. Judge Barringer, for his part, showed no remorse. In the days after the sentencing, he attended a social function at the country club. People who believed in law and order congratulated him on his strong stance. He accepted the compliments stiffly, wearing a smug expression that broadcast his sense of untouchability. He had spent decades on the bench, establishing a reputation for harsh sentences. A chunk of the local population applauded him, especially those who never had to worry about being on the receiving end of his rulings. But that confidence would soon be tested. As the weeks passed, the story slowly crept beyond the confines of Greenwood Falls. A journalist from a regional TV station interviewed Ms. Carver and Roberta Fontaine. Footage of the tearful women, one confessing her role in the bureaucratic error, the other bemoaning the cruel fate of her son, sparked a flash of empathy from viewers throughout the state. Activists demanded to see the court transcripts, suspecting that the harsh sentence was racially motivated. Even some local attorneys, typically wary of speaking out against a judge, whispered in the hallways about the case's glaring injustice. Then, without warning, the story broke on a national scale. A high-profile civil rights lawyer named Tanisha Graves took an interest in the case after it appeared in a national publication's expose on questionable judiciary practices in small towns. Graves, known for her tenacity and success in similar cases, announced she would file a formal appeal on Drexel's behalf. Suddenly, Judge Barringer's name became synonymous with a potential civil rights violation. Over dinner tables and in social media forums across the country, discussions brewed about the fairness of Drexel Fontaine's 2-year sentence for essentially borrowing a friend's car. Drexel himself heard about these developments in bits and pieces. Menendez visited him in the county jail, relaying that Tanisha Graves was on board, that national coverage was growing, that they might have a shot at overturning the sentence. Drexel's emotions were a swirl of hope, disbelief, and exhaustion. He had spent several weeks behind bars, contending with the fear of what 2 full years might look like. Guards eyed him with bored indifference, while some inmates glanced at him with curiosity, wondering what he had done to end up there. Telling them he'd borrowed a car with expired tags, usually garnered baffled stares or dark chuckles. But beneath that confusion lay a current of quiet understanding of how the system could chew someone up on a whim. Meanwhile, Judge Barringer continued presiding over his docket as though nothing was amiss. He showed no outward sign of feeling pressured by the coverage. If anything, he grew more rigid, more controlling in his courtroom. Observers noted he seemed eager to prove that he would not be swayed by public opinion. On multiple occasions, he chastised attorneys who asked for leniency in sentencing, as though determined to reinforce his image as the ultimate arbiter of law and order. One gray morning, however, everything changed. Court was in session. Judge Barringer was hearing a pre-trial motion in a different case. Outside, a group of protesters wielded signs decrying the Fontaine sentence as an emblem of judicial misconduct. The protest had grown. Now it numbered nearly 100 people, and local police had set up barricades to manage the crowd. Tensions were high, but up to that point, the demonstration remained peaceful, with chants echoing across the courthouse lawn. Inside, the atmosphere was all business. Barringer sat perched behind the bench, lips pursed. His gaze flicked over a file, ignoring the muted noise from outside. Then, unexpectedly, his clerk approached the bench, whispering something in the judge's ear. His eyes flickered with annoyance. The clerk handed him a slip of paper. Court watchers would later claim they saw the judge's face go momentarily pale. He cleared his throat. "The court will take a brief recess," he announced, rising abruptly. Puzzled murmurs spread through the gallery as Judge Barringer disappeared into his chambers. Once inside, he closed the door firmly. The small, wood-paneled room was stacked with law books and smelled of stale coffee. His desk phone had a blinking red light indicating an incoming call. The slip of paper the clerk had given him bore a short note. "POTUS office. Urgent." Judge Barringer's hand trembled as he picked up the phone. He had never received a direct call from the president's office in all his years on the bench. This had to be some mistake, or maybe a staffer was calling about a routine inquiry. Yet he knew deep down it likely had something to do with the swirling controversy around Drexel Fontaine's case. He pressed the blinking button, and a voice crackled through the line. "Please hold for the President of the United States." For a moment, Judge Berenger stood in stunned silence. Then a familiar voice, one that he had heard countless times on the news, spoke through the receiver. "Judge Berenger, I won't take too much of your time," the president said, voice resonant even over the phone. "I've just been made aware of a situation in your jurisdiction." Berenger's mouth went dry. He replied in a hushed, quivering tone, "Yes, Mr. President. I'm listening." What followed was a calm, direct statement, heavy with implication. The president spoke about the justice system, about the importance of fair sentencing, and then addressed the specifics of Drexel Fontaine's case. Though the president kept the conversation respectful, there was no mistaking the implicit rebuke. A wave of contradictory emotions overwhelmed the judge: astonishment, indignation at the intrusion into his authority, and unmistakable fear. This was the leader of the country informing him that the White House was aware of the Fontaine case, and that it was reflective of a broader concern about judicial overreach and racial bias. Berenger managed to stammer out a response. "Yes, Mr. President, I understand your concerns. Of course, the matter is under appeal. So the system is handling it." From the other end came a measured but potent reply. "Judge, I'd like to believe in our system as well, but when the public sees injustice, it erodes faith in all of us. We need to ensure that every citizen is treated equally. I trust you'll give that some serious thought." The call ended with a polite but firm goodbye, leaving Judge Berenger standing there in his office, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He was a man who prided himself on the unwavering application of the law. At least, that was how he saw himself. But never had he been so publicly called out at such a high level. His hand shook as he set the phone down, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. He walked over to the window and peered through the blinds. Down below, he could see the throng of protesters, signs lifted, voices raised. Then he glanced at the framed certificate on the wall, the one that commemorated his decades of service, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Returning to the bench a few minutes later, Judge Berenger looked visibly rattled. A hush fell over the courtroom. He cleared his throat. "Where were we?" he asked, forcing a semblance of composure. But his voice lacked its usual authority. In that moment, the attorneys, the defendants, even the bailiffs, sensed that some fundamental shift had just occurred. Word of the president's call spread quickly through hush-hush whispers, first among the courthouse staff, then to a handful of journalists who picked it up like wildfire. By the end of the day, the entire town was talking about it. The speculation about what might happen to Drexel Fontaine's case soared. Some people claimed that the president had directly demanded the judge release Drexel. Others said it was nothing but a courtesy call, an empty gesture. Regardless, the public scrutiny of Judge Berenger reached a fever pitch. Behind bars, Drexel heard about it from Menendez. The lawyer's eyes sparkled with cautious optimism. "This is big, Drexel. I mean, it's not often you have the president weighing in. Doesn't guarantee we win, but it sure raises the pressure. We filed a motion for reconsideration. Maybe that stiff-necked judge will think twice before ignoring the tide of public opinion and the obvious evidence in our favor." Drexel swallowed hard. Hope was a dangerous thing. He tried to manage his expectations, but he couldn't help feeling a glimmer of relief. Sure enough, the judge scheduled a special hearing for additional considerations in the Fontaine case. The hearing date arrived in a sweltering haze of August heat. By then, national news crews had descended on Greenwood Falls. Vans with satellite dishes filled the courthouse parking lot, and reporters prowled about, eager for interviews. Protesters now numbered in the hundreds, chanting demands for justice. A line of people snaked around the building, each hoping to witness the hearing. Inside, every seat was occupied. Some stood along the walls. Security was tight. Anxious bailiffs patrolled the aisles. Drexel was escorted in by 2 officers, wearing the same borrowed brown suit. This time, though, The eyes of the nation felt upon him. He could sense cameras capturing every expression. The tension in the air was a tangible thing, like the crackle of static electricity before a storm. Judge Barringer took the bench. He cleared his throat twice, his face taut, his composure rigid. One might have mistaken him for a statue if not for the nervous flicker in his eyes. He folded his hands in front of him, looked out over the packed courtroom, and began to speak. In light of recent developments, and after careful review of the appellate motion filed by counsel, I am granting a reconsideration of Mr. Fontaine's sentence. During the initial trial, there may have been oversights regarding the defendant's intent and knowledge regarding the vehicle's registration status. Ms. Carver's testimony, which I may not have given sufficient weight at the time, clarifies key points. Therefore, the sentence of 2 years in a state correctional facility is hereby vacated. The charges of vehicle theft will be set aside, and the defendant will be released immediately. A deafening silence fell, as though the entire room had gasped in unison and then forgotten to exhale. Slowly, Ms. Carver's hand shot up to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Roberta Fontaine released a sob of relief that reverberated off the walls. Drexel's heart pounded so fiercely that he thought he might faint. For a moment, he just stood there, mind racing, trying to make sense of what he just heard. Then, like the sudden roar of a wave, applause and cries of gratitude broke out among the spectators. People began hugging one another, weeping openly. The bailiffs scrambled to restore some semblance of order. Judge Barringer tapped his gavel weakly, almost half-heartedly, before giving up. Drexel's chains were removed. He was free. He stumbled toward his mother, who wrapped her arms around him so tightly he could barely breathe. Ms. Carver joined in, tears streaming down her cheeks. Flashbulbs popped, cameras rolled, capturing the moment. As Drexel looked around, he saw something in the judge's expression, an icy glare that suggested he was furious at being backed into a corner. But there was also a hint of fear, perhaps a glimmer of regret, that flickered across his features. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers when Drexel emerged from the courthouse. He inhaled the warm air, tasting freedom in every breath. Strangers patted him on the back, calling him a hero or a symbol. But all Drexel felt was relief. Relief that he could hold his mother's hand without shackles, that he could go home and sleep in his own bed, that he could be a free man again. The next day, newspapers across the country ran headlines about the judge who reversed his sentence after presidential call. Some stories highlighted Drexel's perseverance, while others focused on the systemic issues that allowed such an injustice to happen in the first place. Calls for an inquiry into Judge Barringer's past rulings escalated, culminating in a formal investigation by the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. The once invincible judge found himself under the microscope, forced to account for a string of disproportionately harsh sentences, especially those affecting defendants of color. In the weeks that followed, Drexel tried to return to normal life. But it was as if he had stepped onto a different path. His story became a symbol for those who felt voiceless in the justice system. The national civil rights lawyer, Tanisha Graves, encouraged him to speak at rallies and conferences. At first, Drexel was hesitant. Public speaking terrified him. He had grown up trying not to draw attention to himself. Yet he recognized this was bigger than him now. So he stood on podiums, sometimes in front of hundreds of people, voice trembling but determined, sharing his experience and advocating for reforms so nobody else would endure what he had. He spoke about fear, about the terror of a system that can crush someone without blinking. He spoke about the humiliation of sitting in a jail cell for a non-crime and the heartbreak of watching his mother cry. But he also spoke about hope, hope in the people who rallied behind him, hope in the small acts of kindness that Ms. Carver and others had shown, hope in the idea that justice might still prevail when enough voices demand it. One scorching afternoon, a major network invited him for a televised interview. Sitting across from a prominent journalist, Drexel discussed his ordeal. The host asked him, "Do you harbor resentment toward Judge Barringer?" Drexel paused. He thought of the judge's face, that cold stare, the harsh sentence. He recalled the phone call from the president that had stunned the entire courtroom. Slowly he exhaled. "I don't know if resentment is the right word," he said. "I feel anger for the way the system allowed that kind of judgment to happen. But I think what I feel most is sadness. Sadness that we live in a world where someone can have that much power over another person's life and use it unfairly. I hope we can change that." The camera captured his composure, the sincerity in his eyes. In that moment, viewers across the country saw not just a victim of injustice, but a man who had emerged from adversity with profound empathy. Drexel's message of reform and compassion resonated widely. Meanwhile, Judge Berenger's reputation was in tatters. The Judicial Oversight Committee uncovered numerous instances where he had stretched or misapplied sentencing guidelines, nearly always to the detriment of minority defendants. Complaints of misconduct piled up. Activists campaigned for his removal. In Greenwood Falls, public sentiment turned sharply against him. Even some of his old supporters withdrew, wary of standing by a man whose prejudice had become national news. Faced with mounting evidence and political pressure, Berenger announced his resignation from the bench, effective immediately. He issued a brief public statement claiming he was stepping down to preserve the integrity of the court and spend time with family. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, only the barest hint of resignation in his clipped tone. But the message was clear. The era of Judge Mason H. Berenger, with all its fear and bias, was over. Drexel learned of the resignation from a friend's text message. He was sitting at his mother's kitchen table, reading old letters of support people had sent from all over the country, some from as far away as Alaska, others from small towns just like Greenwood Falls, all containing similar messages. "Thank you for speaking up. You represent hope. Don't stop fighting." The flood of kindness often moved him to tears, but today he felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the man who had nearly ruined his life was no longer in a position to harm others. Sorrow that it took such a public outcry and a call from the president to correct a glaring injustice that should have never happened in the first place. Months passed. The media storm subsided, though interest in criminal justice reform remained high. Drexel returned to Greenwood Falls, not so much by choice as by the fact that it was home. But the town felt different now. A new district attorney had replaced the old one, running on a platform of fair sentencing and oversight. The courthouse steps that once felt cold and unwelcoming no longer terrified him. He had walked those halls as a victim of the system and left them as a symbol of change. One evening, as the crickets chirped under a soft, star-sprinkled sky, Drexel sat on his porch with his mother. She rocked in an old wicker chair, humming a lullaby she used to sing when he was a child. A gentle breeze teased the edges of his hair. It was a rare moment of peace. "Ma, do you ever think about what would have happened if the president hadn't made that call?" he asked softly, staring out at the darkened street. She paused, her voice thoughtful. "I do, son, and I try not to dwell on it too long. But I also remember all the people who stood up for you, Ms. Carver, Mr. Menendez, the activists, the journalists. Even without the president, I like to believe justice would have found its way." He reached over to take her hand, the faint sounds of night enveloping them. Though he knew the president's intervention was indeed pivotal, he also recognized it was the collective moral force of ordinary individuals that truly saved him. That was the powerful lesson he took from the ordeal, the importance of every voice, every gesture of solidarity, and the unyielding determination to do what is right, even when the odds seem impossibly stacked. In the following weeks, Drexel began volunteering at a local community center, helping young people learn basic job skills and tutoring them in math and reading. He discovered a passion for guiding others, particularly those who risked falling through the same societal cracks that had almost devoured him. He spoke of his experiences candidly, warning them about the pitfalls of a legal system that could be both blind and biased. He taught them about their rights, about the necessity of being vigilant, and most importantly, about the strength that comes from unity. During a quiet day at the community center, a teen approached him, a tall kid named Marcus who had grown up on the same side of town. Marcus admitted he had nearly given up on school, feeling that no matter what he did, people saw him as trouble. The teen's eyes glistened with tears as he explained how hearing Drexel's story on the news made him realize that sometimes society is unfair, but that giving up only lets the system win. Drexel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You keep fighting," he said, "not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. We can't let despair define us." Those words echoed his mother's old guidance, re-emerging in a new form. If there was any silver lining to his ordeal, it was the capacity to comfort and inspire others. The intangible sense of shared resilience made his struggles feel less senseless. Months turned to a year. Under mounting community and state pressure, a full-scale review of Judge Berenger's past cases began. Several convictions were overturned. Others were commuted to more appropriate sentences. Families, once shattered by long absences of their loved ones, rejoiced in the chance to rebuild. Though far from perfect restitution, it served as an overdue correction to years of prejudice cloaked in legal authority. Greenwood Falls itself gradually transformed into a microcosm of broader social progress, slow and perfect, but real. On a brisk autumn morning, Drexel stood near the courthouse steps, gazing at the building's imposing columns. He had been invited to speak at an event commemorating the New Access to Justice initiative that aimed to provide better legal resources to indigent defendants. He could hardly believe how drastically his life had changed. From a frightened young man in a jail cell to a voice championing reform, it felt surreal. Looking out over the small crowd, he saw Ms. Carver smiling at him, tears in her eyes. He saw his mother, standing front and center, pride emanating from every pore. Menendez was there as well, arms folded, nodding encouragingly. As Drexel took the microphone, he remembered how terrified he once felt, how powerless. But now, that sense of purpose steadied him. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice resonating across the old courthouse plaza. "This building behind us represents the law. But the law isn't just bricks and mortar. It isn't just rules written in a book. It's people who interpret, enforce, and live under it. When bias seeps into those decisions, it can destroy a life in a matter of minutes. I'm standing here because I experienced that bias firsthand. But I'm also standing here because people cared enough to fight back and, ultimately, to restore hope." He paused, letting his words settle. The crisp autumn air carried the faint sound of leaves rustling. "This new initiative is a step in the right direction," he continued. "But the real change has to come from each of us, from our willingness to see justice as more than a rigid set of rules. It's a promise of fairness, of equal treatment under the law, that should apply to every single person, regardless of race or background. It's a promise we can only keep if we hold each other accountable." A collective silence embraced his speech, and then applause began, soft at first, then building in intensity. Drexel's cheeks warmed with emotion. He felt a surge of gratitude and resolve. He imagined the many others still caught in the gears of injustice, praying for a lifeline. He vowed to continue working toward a world where such calls for help need not rely on a miracle or a presidential phone call to be heard. As the applause subsided, Drexel caught sight of a passing figure in the crowd, someone wearing a cap pulled low over their face. For a moment, he thought it was Judge Berenger, but that was impossible. The man had vanished from public view. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light or the swirl of memory. Yet, for a split second, Drexel felt a pang of empathy for the judge, a man so consumed by prejudice that he couldn't see the humanity in front of him. Ultimately, the judge was forced to confront a truth he'd spent a lifetime denying: that every person who stands before the bench is a human being whose life holds value. The moral weight of that reality pressed on Drexel's heart. Regardless of the judge's downfall, the real victory would be ensuring that racism and injustice weren't given new corners to hide. The journey was far from over. Later that day, Drexel walked with his mother back to their car, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. She slipped her arm through his, letting her head rest against his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "So proud." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm just following your example, Ma." She smiled and stopped to look at him. Her eyes sparkled with tears, but they were tears of joy and relief. "We've come a long way," she said. "Remember that day you borrowed Miss Carver's car?" Drexel shivered at the recollection. "Yeah, feels like it happened in another lifetime. But it was a stepping stone," she said, "leading us all here. Maybe in some strange way, this had to happen so you could grow into the person you are now." He nodded, acknowledging the complexity of fate. "Maybe so," he admitted. He couldn't help but wonder about the thousand ways life could have turned out differently. But each version of possibility had led him to this moment, standing in the glow of dusk, free and determined to make the world a little fairer than he found it. They reached the car. The shadows lengthened across the parking lot. Before opening the door, Drexel looked over the courthouse one last time. He didn't feel the bitterness that once consumed him when he thought of that building. He felt a sense of responsibility, of duty, and maybe even a strange gratitude. Gratitude that the system, though flawed, could still be swayed by conscience, by collective outrage, by the unstoppable force of truth. Sliding into the driver's seat, he adjusted the rearview mirror. His mother settled in beside him, the seatbelt clicking. For a moment, he glanced at his own reflection in the mirror. Older, wiser, eyes carrying both pain and determination. Then, with a quiet hum, he started the engine. They drove away from the courthouse, away from the heartbreak that once threatened to consume them, and toward the faint promise of a better tomorrow. Above them, the sky was streaked with gold and purple, a silent testament to transformation. And in the hush of that closing day, the words of countless supporters and the echo of an unexpected presidential phone call lingered like a beacon, reminding everyone who heard the story that justice, though often delayed or distorted, can still triumph when good people refuse to remain silent. In the end, the moral lesson was etched clearly for all to see. When people unite against oppression, no single judge, no matter how powerful, can stand in the way of truth. Racism, prejudice, and the misuse of authority are formidable foes, but they crumble beneath collective courage and unwavering compassion. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, the reminder that each of us holds a thread of responsibility for the world's tapestry of justice. If we weave those threads together, no amount of darkness can smother the light of fairness and equality.